Lake Pinecrest was everything I had dreamed about since I was a child. The water stretched out like a sheet of blue glass each morning, reflecting the surrounding pine trees and the occasional cloud that drifted lazily through the sky. I remember the day I first toured the property, standing on that sloping lawn that led down to the private dock, watching a heron glide across the water. It felt like destiny. 3 years of overtime shifts and careful saving had finally paid off. This lakefront house was mine. The neighbors seemed pleasant enough during those first few months. The retired couple next door brought over a homemade lasagna. The family across the street invited me to their 4th of July barbecue. Everyone commented on how nice it was to see the property being cared for again after sitting vacant for nearly a year. The previous owner had moved to a retirement community in Arizona, leaving behind a home that needed considerable work. I spent weekends painting, landscaping, and fixing the dock that extended into the clear waters of Lake Pinecrest. My passion had always been boats. Not just any boats, boats with history, boats with stories. The first one I brought to my new home was my grandfather's fishing boat. He had taught me everything about fishing in that 16-foot aluminum vessel with the slightly mismatched seats and the faded Evinrude motor. When he passed away 5 years ago, it was the only thing of his I wanted. The boat represented sunrise mornings on the lake, the smell of coffee from his old thermos, and the patient way he showed me how to tie fishing knots with my small, clumsy fingers. The second boat arrived 3 months after I moved in, a pontoon boat I found through an online listing. The owner was moving and needed to sell quickly. I imagined summer gatherings with friends aboard that spacious deck, coolers of drinks and music playing while we drifted along the shoreline. The neighbors waved from their docks as I brought it home, several calling out compliments as I carefully maneuvered it into place beside my grandfather's fishing boat. The third boat was my true labor of love, a 1958 Chris Craft wooden runabout that I discovered in a barn 40 miles away. It was in terrible condition, the varnish cracked and peeling, the engine seized from sitting unused for over a decade. I negotiated the price down and brought it home on a trailer. That winter, I converted half of my garage into a restoration workshop. Each evening after work, I would lose myself for hours in the meditative process of stripping away old finish, repairing damaged planks, and lovingly bringing that classic vessel back to life. By spring, all 3 boats were displayed proudly along my waterfront. The fishing boat and pontoon floated at the dock, while the still being restored Chris Craft sat on its trailer near the water's edge, covered with a custom-fitted tarp when I was not working on it. I was living my dream, a house on the water with my small fleet of beloved boats. Each one served a different purpose, from fishing to socializing to the pure joy of restoration craftsmanship. The white envelope with the Lake Pinecrest Homeowners Association logo arrived on a Tuesday. I had skimmed through the HOA materials when purchasing the house, noting standard regulations about lawn maintenance and exterior paint colors. Nothing had stood out as particularly restrictive. I tore open the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Notice of violation. Excessive watercraft storage was printed in bold letters across the top. The letter cited community standards concerns and referenced a rule limiting visible recreational water vessels. It instructed me to remedy the situation within 14 days or face potential fines. I reread the letter twice, then walked to my back windows and looked out at my carefully maintained property and the 3 boats that represented so much more than mere possessions. Everything was clean, organized, and attractive. There were no eyesores, no clutter. I crumpled the letter and tossed it into my kitchen trash can. Surely this was some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. I had more important things to worry about. The Chris Craft needed a new water pump, and I had just ordered the parts. I would sort out this HOA nonsense later. The Lake Pinecrest Community Center was a single-story building with cream-colored siding and forest green trim. Inside, metal folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a long table at the front of the room. I arrived 10 minutes before the scheduled 7 p.m. start time for the monthly HOA meeting, nodding to a few familiar faces as I selected a seat in the back row. I had my copy of the violation notice folded in my pocket. My plan was simple: explain my situation during the open forum portion of the meeting, clarify that my boats were well maintained and part of lakeside living, and resolve any misunderstanding. The meeting began precisely on time. A thin woman with steel gray hair pulled into a tight bun called the meeting to order. Good evening, everyone. I am Karen Mitchell, president of the Lake Pinecrest Homeowners Association. Let us begin with the approval of last month's minutes. Her voice carried a practiced authority that filled the room despite her slender frame. She wore a navy blue blazer with gold buttons and pearl earrings that caught the fluorescent light when she moved her head. The meeting proceeded through a tedious agenda: landscaping contract renewals, discussion of the upcoming community garage sale, debate about replacing the aging playground equipment near the community center. I shifted in my uncomfortable metal chair, waiting for the open forum section listed at the bottom of the printed agenda I had been handed upon arrival. Finally, Karen adjusted her reading glasses and announced, "We will now open the floor for resident concerns. Please keep your comments to under 3 minutes. Who would like to speak first?" I raised my hand, and she pointed at me with a slight frown. "The gentleman in the back, please approach the microphone and state your name and address for the record." I walked to the small podium positioned to the side of the board table. "Good evening. My name is Thomas Lawson. I live at 47 Lakeshore Drive. I received a violation notice about my boats and wanted to discuss it." I held up the letter. "I have 3 boats on my lakefront property: a fishing boat, a pontoon, and a wooden runabout I am restoring. They are all well maintained and appropriate for a lakefront home." The letter mentions excessive watercraft, but I do not see how having boats on a lake property could be considered excessive. Karen removed her reading glasses, letting them hang from a chain around her neck. "Mr. Lawson, thank you for bringing this to our attention. The violation refers to Bylaw 732, which clearly states that no property shall display more than 1 recreational water vessel visible from common areas. This includes visibility from the lake itself, which is considered a common area. You are in violation by having 3 vessels instead of the permitted one." I looked around the room, noting several other waterfront homeowners I recognized. "I apologize, but I do not recall seeing this restriction when reviewing the HOA documents. Many lakefront properties have multiple kayaks, canoes, or boats. Has this rule been consistently enforced?" Karen's expression tightened. "Bylaw 732 has been in effect since the community was established. Perhaps you should have read your documents more carefully before purchasing your home. And yes, we enforce all bylaws consistently." Her tone suggested the matter was closed, but I persisted. "With respect, living on a lake naturally lends itself to having multiple water vessels for different purposes. My grandfather's fishing boat has sentimental value. The pontoon is for entertaining guests. The wooden boat is a restoration project that will enhance the vintage aesthetic many homes in our community display. All are properly stored and maintained. Could the board consider a variance or exception for lakefront properties?" Several heads nodded subtly around the room. An older man, too, rose ahead of me, shifted as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it when Karen's gaze swept over him. Karen placed her palms flat on the table. "Rules exist for uniformity and property values, Mr. Lawson. If we made exceptions for one resident, we would need to do so for everyone. That is not how a properly functioning HOA operates. You have 30 days from the date of the notice to comply or face escalating fines beginning at $200 per week. Her smile never reached her eyes. Next speaker, please. I stood my ground. Could we at least put this to a community vote, if other residents do not object to? The board has already voted on these bylaws, Mr. Lawson, Karen interrupted. Your time is up. Please take your seat. As I walked back to my chair, faces turned away from mine, avoiding eye contact. The meeting continued with discussions about gutter cleaning and mailbox uniformity standards. When it finally ended, I gathered my things slowly, hoping to speak with other board members individually. As residents filed out, a man in his 60s with a weathered face approached me in the parking lot. "Name's Bill Thompson," he said quietly, glancing around before continuing. "Wanted to let you know, Karen has been running this HOA like her personal kingdom for 15 years. She lost a local election years back, and this is the only power she has left. She blocks every attempt to modify the bylaws. Tried myself when they cited me for having a kayak and a canoe last year." "So why does everyone put up with it?" I asked. Bill sighed. "Most folks are afraid of becoming targets. Karen and her husband Richard have connections. He sits on the zoning board for the county. Cross them and suddenly your permit applications get lost. Your property gets extra scrutiny." He patted my shoulder. "Just a friendly warning. Pick your battles carefully around here." I watched him walk to his car, the weight of his words settling uncomfortably on my shoulders. As I drove home along the winding road that circled Lake Pinecrest, I noticed for the first time how many properties had boats discreetly stored in garages with doors left partially open, or hidden behind carefully positioned landscaping. The pristine appearance of our community suddenly seemed less like pride of ownership, and more like a facade maintained through fear. The next morning, I drove to Henderson's Boat Storage, a facility about 12 miles from Lake Pinecrest. The monthly rental fee for a covered slip large enough for my pontoon boat made me wince, but I wrote the check anyway. $250 per month was steep, but less than the threatened HOA fines. I arranged for the pontoon to be transported the following day. My grandfather's fishing boat would remain at my dock, my one permitted vessel according to Bylaw 732. The Chris Craft Restoration Project would stay on its trailer, but I purchased an official HOA-approved beige cover for it, matching the exact shade specified in the community guidelines for temporary storage solutions. I believed this compromise would resolve the situation. I was following the letter of the rule while still preserving what mattered most to me. I was wrong. 10 days later, another envelope arrived. This one was thicker than the first. Inside was a formal citation for continued violation of Bylaw 732, along with an invoice for $200. The accompanying photographs showed my property from multiple angles. One photo focused on the covered Chris Craft with a red circle drawn around it and the notation, "Second visible vessel, trailer-stored watercraft counts toward total." Another photo showed my dock with the fishing boat and the empty space where the pontoon had been, with the notation, "Evidence of rotating vessels, violation of spirit of bylaw." I called the HOA office immediately. The receptionist informed me that Karen Mitchell personally handled all violation appeals and that she was unavailable until the following week. I asked if another board member could review my case. "I am sorry, but procedurally, only the president reviews initial appeals," she responded in a tone that suggested this conversation happened frequently. 2 weeks later, a third envelope arrived. This one contained an additional fine of $400 for continued noncompliance and failure to respond to previous notices. The total now stood at $600. The letter stated that liens could be placed on my property if the fines remained unpaid after 60 days. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by HOA documents, violation notices, and my checkbook. The financial reality was stark. The storage fees for the pontoon combined with the mounting HOA fines were becoming unsustainable. With a heavy heart, I made a decision that felt like betrayal. I would sell my grandfather's fishing boat. The vintage Chris Craft was still months away from being water-ready, but it represented a potential investment once restored. The fishing boat, while priceless in sentimental value, would bring in enough cash to cover the existing fines. Rain pelted against the windows 3 days later as I watched the new owner hitch my grandfather's boat to his truck. He was a young father who talked excitedly about teaching his son to fish, just as my grandfather had taught me. I handed over the title and accepted the envelope of cash with a numb feeling in my chest. The boat disappeared around the bend in our street, taking with it conversations and memories that could never be replaced. That evening, I paid the HOA fines in full and sent a certified letter explaining that I now had only one visible vessel, the covered Chris Craft on its trailer, and was therefore in compliance with Bylaw 732. I included photographs documenting the current state of my property. I believed the matter was finally resolved. It was not. The fourth envelope arrived exactly 1 week later. This notice cited a different bylaw, 8.1.4. No recreational equipment, including but not limited to boats, trailers, RVs, or campers, may be stored in any area visible from the street or common areas for more than 72 consecutive hours. The fine was $300. The letter stated that the Chris Craft and trailer must be moved to a non-visible location or off the property entirely. Through my kitchen window the next morning, I spotted Karen walking along the community lakefront path that passed behind my property. She carried her clipboard and a camera with a telephoto lens, stopping periodically to make notes and take photographs. When she reached the edge of my property line, she spent several minutes documenting different angles of my covered boat and the empty dock. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was Diana Wilson from 4 houses down. Her voice was hushed, almost whispering. "Thomas, I thought you should know something. I serve on the Architectural Review Committee, and we just received plans for a new boathouse construction project at Karen's waterfront property. The estimated cost is over $40,000, and it was fast-tracked for approval without the standard review period." "That seems unusual," I replied, wondering why she was telling me this. "More than unusual," Diana continued. "Last month, the HOA Special Projects Fund suddenly had a $35,000 expenditure for shoreline improvement and erosion control. The documentation was minimal, and when I asked questions, I was told it was an emergency approval. The contractor listed is owned by Karen's brother-in-law." After thanking Diana for the information, I spread financial statements and property records across my dining room table. The HOA financial reports were technically public record for all homeowners, but accessing them required an appointment during limited office hours, a deterrent that kept most residents from ever reviewing them. Diana had sent me digital copies of the past 3 years of reports. A pattern quickly emerged. Selective enforcement of bylaws against certain homeowners coincided with sudden increases in HOA fee collections. Special projects materialized immediately following periods of aggressive fine enforcement. Property improvements to board members' homes followed mysterious budget allocations for community enhancements that never manifested in common areas. This was no longer about my boats. This was about a systematic abuse of power that affected everyone in Lake Pinecrest. The morning air held the crisp promise of autumn as I stepped onto my front porch, coffee mug in hand. The sound of an engine drew my attention to the street. A white tow truck with Johnson's Towing emblazoned on its side pulled up in front of my house. Two men in matching uniforms climbed out, followed by Karen Mitchell's Mercedes that parked directly behind them. Karen emerged wearing dark sunglasses despite the cloud cover. She carried her ever-present clipboard and wore a satisfied expression that made my stomach tighten. She approached my property line but did not enter, instead waving the tow operators forward with a flick of her manicured hand. "Excuse me," I called out, placing my coffee mug on the porch railing and walking down my front steps. "What is happening here?" One of the tow operators, a heavy-set man with a name tag reading Mike, looked uncomfortable. "We have an order to remove a boat and trailer from this address." He handed me a form with the Lake Pinecrest HOA letterhead. The document cited multiple bylaw violations and specified removal of the unauthorized watercraft and transport equipment. "This is my property," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "That boat is properly covered according to HOA specifications and is my single permitted vessel now that I have removed the others. You cannot just take it." Karen stepped forward, remaining just on the public sidewalk. "Mr. Lawson, perhaps you failed to read the notice delivered last week. Bylaw 814 prohibits visible storage of recreational equipment, including trailers, for more than 72 hours. Your covered boat has been in the same location for 17 days now. Additionally, the Architectural Review Committee has determined that the cover color you selected does not match the approved beige tone required by the guidelines." "That is the exact cover recommended by your office," I countered, pulling out my phone to show the email from the HOA administrative assistant suggesting the specific brand and model number. Karen glanced at the screen and shrugged. "The digital representation does not accurately reflect the actual shade. Our guidelines are quite specific to prevent the community from looking cluttered." She pronounced the last word as if describing something deeply offensive. "The towing has been authorized by the board. You may recover your property from Johnson's impound lot after paying the outstanding fines and towing fees." I stood in disbelief as the two men approached my craft. The boat I had spent countless hours restoring, sanding each plank by hand, carefully matching the original varnish technique from 1958. "This is harassment," I said, my voice rising. "You cannot do this." Karen checked her watch. "Mr. Lawson, impeding the enforcement of HOA bylaws can result in additional fines. I suggest you step aside and address your concerns through proper channels at the next board meeting." The tow operators looked between us uncertainly. I felt powerless as they began attaching chains to my trailer. The metal links made a harsh sound against the morning quiet as they secured my boat to their vehicle. From across the street, I noticed several neighbors watching from behind curtains or while pretending to collect mail. No one intervened. No one spoke up. Fear of becoming Karen's next target kept them silent witnesses to what was happening. The wooden craft shuddered as the tow truck began pulling it forward. The boat that had been my weekend sanctuary, my connection to a craftsmanship era long past, was being dragged away because of an arbitrary rule selectively enforced by a woman drunk on her tiny kingdom of power. Karen caught my eye and smiled thinly before checking something off on her clipboard. The gesture was small but unmistakable. This was personal satisfaction for her, not community enforcement. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her Mercedes, the tow truck following with my beloved boat in tow. That evening, I sat surrounded by financial records and property documents. The HOA financial statements Diana had shared revealed a pattern of suspicious expenditures. 3 separate line items labeled legal consultation, totaling over $20,000, appeared immediately following Karen's boathouse approval. Board meeting minutes showed no discussion of litigation or legal issues during that period. My hands trembled with a mixture of anger and devastation. The Johnsons' towing impound fee was $400. The additional HOA fines totaled $750. To recover my boat, I would need to pay over $1,000, money I did not have readily available after the costly storage fees and previous fines. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my dark thoughts. When I opened the door, an elderly man with a weathered face and bright eyes stood on my porch. He wore a flannel shirt despite the mild evening, and his posture suggested someone who had worked physical jobs most of his life. "Evening," he said, extending his hand. "Marcus Donnelly, live over on Cedar Point." He gestured vaguely toward the eastern shore of the lake. "Saw what happened with your boat this morning. Thought I should stop by." I invited him in, offering coffee which he gratefully accepted. Marcus settled into my kitchen chair with the ease of someone comfortable in any setting. "Been developing property around these parts for 40 years before I retired," he explained, cupping his coffee mug in calloused hands. "Built half the neighborhoods in this county, including the original section of Lake Pinecrest back in the 70s. I nodded, unsure why he was telling me this. Marcus took a slow sip of coffee before continuing. "Saw you had a real nice wooden runabout. Chris Craft, right? 1950s model." "1958, I confirmed. Been restoring it for months." Marcus nodded appreciatively. "Good craftsmanship there. Shame about what happened. That Karen is something else. Been making folks miserable around here since she moved in. Husband Richard is no better, uses his position on the zoning board to do her dirty work. Seems they have the entire neighborhood under their thumb," I said bitterly. Marcus set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "You know, something interesting about this development most folks have forgotten. The actual lake itself, Lake Pinecrest, is not community property." I looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Old man Wilkins, Joseph Wilkins, he owned all this land back in the day. When he sold me the parcels for development, he kept ownership of the lake itself. Said his daddy used to fish those waters and he wanted to maintain control of it. Smart move, legally speaking. HOA has easement rights for residents to use the lake, but Wilkins still holds the deed to the actual body of water." I leaned forward, suddenly alert. "Who owns it now?" Marcus smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "Still old man Wilkins. He is 93 now, lives down in a retirement community in Florida. His grandson manages his affairs, but from what I hear, he is looking to liquidate some assets, including the lake." "The lake is for sale," I repeated, my mind racing with possibilities. "Not officially on the market yet," Marcus said, "but word gets around in development circles. Asking price is steep, about $350,000, includes mineral rights, water rights, everything. Who knows what the HOA would do if someone else bought it?" He chuckled, clearly enjoying the thought. As Marcus left an hour later, he handed me a crumpled business card with Joseph Wilkins' grandson's contact information. "Food for thought," he said with a wink before disappearing into the evening darkness. I stood in my doorway watching his taillights vanish around the curve of Lakeshore Drive. For the first time since the tow truck had taken my boat, I felt something other than despair. A plan, audacious and possibly impossible, was forming in my mind. If Karen Mitchell thought she owned this community through her HOA dictatorship, Perhaps it was time to show her at real ownership looked like. The local library became my second home over the next 2 weeks. I requested every book they had on riparian rights, water access laws, and property easements. The legal terminology was dense, but I took careful notes, building my understanding piece by piece. During lunch breaks at work, I researched similar cases online, situations where privately owned lakes intersected with community access rights. The legal picture that emerged was fascinating. As the potential owner of Lake Pinecrest itself, I would control all water access rights. The HOA had negotiated easements for residents to use the lake, but these agreements could be renegotiated by the lake's owner. More importantly, water access could be regulated through a permit system that I would control. My financial situation presented the greatest challenge. The asking price of $350,000 was far beyond my savings. My home had built some equity since purchase, but not nearly enough to cover this investment. I spent evenings at my kitchen table running calculations, exploring options that seemed increasingly desperate. The solution came from an unexpected direction. My grandfather had left me a small portfolio of conservative investments when he passed away. I had never touched them, viewing them as a future retirement supplement. Combined with my savings and a home equity line of credit, I could raise about $200,000, still significantly short of the asking price. I called Robert Wilkins, the grandson managing his grandfather's affairs. After explaining my interest in the lake property, I asked if he would consider owner financing for part of the purchase price. "I can put down $200,000 immediately," I explained. "The remaining amount could be paid over 5 years with interest." Robert was silent for a moment. "Interesting proposal," he finally replied. "My grandfather has been trying to simplify his estate planning. A lump sum payment with guaranteed income might appeal to him. Let me discuss it with him and our attorney." 3 days later, Robert called back. "We are prepared to accept your offer with some conditions. The down payment must be non-refundable, interest will be 3 points above prime, and we will retain mineral rights below 30 feet. I agreed immediately. The terms were secondary to securing ownership of the lake itself. We arranged to meet the following week with our respective attorneys to draw up the paperwork. Meanwhile, I continued my research. I established Pinecrest Watershed Management, LLC, as a legal entity to own and manage the lake property. This corporate structure would provide protection from personal liability and create a professional framework for implementing the access permit system I envisioned. Late at night, in a spare bedroom I had converted into an investigation headquarters, I meticulously documented every instance of HOA overreach and selective enforcement. Photographs of similar violations that went unpenalized at board members' properties. Financial records showing questionable expenditures coinciding with Karen's personal home improvements. Email threads where residents complained about inconsistent rule enforcement only to be dismissed or ignored. I created a portfolio of evidence organized into clear categories: financial mismanagement, selective enforcement, conflicts of interest, and procedural violations. Each allegation was supported by documentation, dates, and specific bylaw references. This was not just about my boats anymore. This was about bringing accountability to a system corrupted by years of unchecked power. The meeting with Robert Wilkins and our attorneys took place in a wood-paneled conference room at the offices of Hargrove and Miller, LLC. The documents spread across the polished table told the history of Lake Pinecrest through property transfers and legal descriptions. Robert pushed a yellowed folder toward me. These are the original easement agreements my grandfather negotiated with the developers in 1974, he explained. The HOA has rights to access the lake for recreational purposes, but those rights are subject to the owner's management decisions regarding conservation, safety, and resource protection. My attorney highlighted key passages granting the lake owner authority to implement reasonable access regulations and establish permits or usage guidelines necessary for the preservation and management of the water resource. Robert Wilkins sipped his coffee thoughtfully. My grandfather always told me he kept the lake because he did not trust developers to protect it properly. He would be pleased to know it is going to someone who cares about the lake itself, not just what can be built around it. By the end of the 4-hour meeting, I had signed dozens of documents, transferred my life savings, and become the legal owner of 85 acres of freshwater lake. The property did not include the shoreline that belonged to the individual homeowners and the HOA, but it included the water itself and the lake bed beneath it to a depth of 30 feet. As I drove home that evening, I looked at Lake Pinecrest with new eyes. The setting sun reflected off its surface in shimmers of orange and gold. Children played on floating docks while couples in kayaks paddled along the shoreline. Karen Mitchell's house stood prominent on the north shore, her private dock extending from a professionally landscaped yard. None of them knew yet. None of them realized that the seemingly unchangeable power structure of our community had just been fundamentally altered. In my briefcase rested the deed to Lake Pinecrest and the legal authority to determine who could access its waters. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I marked the date on my calendar and began preparing the documents I would need for my presentation. Karen Mitchell's reign was about to face an unexpected challenge. The county recorder's office was housed in a brutalist concrete building downtown. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting, I waited as a clerk with reading glasses perched on her nose processed the lake ownership transfer documents. Each page received a mechanical stamp, thunk, 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 the sound marking the official recording of my new property rights. "All set, Mr. Lawson," the clerk said, handing me a leather portfolio containing the stamped documents. "Congratulations on your purchase." I thanked her and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. In my car, I opened the portfolio once more, still not quite believing what I had accomplished. The property description read, "All waters and submerged lands of Lake Pinecrest, approximately 85 acres, as described in the original survey dated June 12, 1953. The owner line clearly stated, Pinecrest Watershed Management, LLC. The next 5 days passed in a blur of preparation. I created a professional presentation outlining the new lake access permit system. I consulted with a water resource management expert to ensure my plans included legitimate conservation measures. I spent hours rehearsing what I would say at the HOA meeting, anticipating questions and challenges that might arise. On Tuesday evening, I arrived at the community center 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting time. I connected my laptop to the projector system and tested my presentation slides. Other residents began filtering in, filling the rows of metal folding chairs. Several nodded politely in my direction, but most avoided eye contact. My reputation as a troublemaker had clearly spread throughout the community. Karen Mitchell arrived 5 minutes before the meeting, flanked by 2 other board members. She wore a cream-colored blazer with gold buttons and carried her signature clipboard. Her eyes narrowed slightly when she noticed me sitting calmly in the front row, but she said nothing as she took her place at the center of the board table. "Good evening, everyone," Karen began precisely at 7, 11:00 p.m. I call this meeting of the Lake Pinecrest Homeowners Association to order. First item on our agenda is approval of last month's minutes. The meeting proceeded through routine business. Landscaping contracts were reviewed. A proposal for new playground equipment was tabled until the next budget cycle. Committee reports were delivered with the drowsy predictability that characterized most HOA meetings. Then Karen reached the violations and enforcement section of the agenda. She adjusted her reading glasses and began reciting a list of recent citations. When she reached my name, her voice took on a note of particular satisfaction. Thomas Lawson, 47 Lakeshore Drive, multiple continued violations of Bylaws 732 and 814 regarding watercraft storage and visible recreational equipment. Mr. Lawson has failed to retrieve his impounded boat or pay outstanding fines totaling $1,050. The board recommends proceeding with a property lien as outlined in our enforcement procedures. I raised my hand calmly. Karen ignored me and continued to the next violation. I raised my hand higher, keeping it steadily aloft until other residents began to notice and turn in my direction. Finally, Karen sighed audibly. Mr. Lawson appears to have a comment. During the violations report, resident comments are typically not recognized, but in the interest of moving forward, you may have 30 seconds. I stood and approached the podium. Thank you, President Mitchell. I believe the community would benefit from hearing some new information before proceeding with any liens or enforcement actions. May I use the projector for a brief presentation during the open forum portion of the meeting? Karen's mouth tightened, but with all eyes on her, she had little choice. You will be limited to the standard 3 minutes during open forum. I nodded and returned to my seat. The meeting continued through 2 more agenda items before reaching the open forum. When Karen called my name, I walked confidently to the podium and connected my laptop to the projector. Good evening, neighbors, I began, my heart pounding despite my calm exterior. Before discussing specific violations, I believe there is important information the community should know about Lake Pinecrest itself. My first slide appeared on the screen, a certified copy of the property deed I had received from the county recorder's office. As of last Thursday, I am the legal owner of Lake Pinecrest and all access rights to its waters.